Hi there, I'm Patsy Thompson. It's the end of a long day. You're going to have to excuse this crazy hair. Today I want to show you a couple of swirled plume designs. They both feature plumes and swirls, and they both have a wonderful gentle movement, but they look just a little bit different, and they're a little bit different to create. Let's get started. The plume curl forward design features a swirl with plumes that are hugging it in an orientation where the plumes spring toward the center of the swirl. The plume curl away design features a swirl with plumes that also hug it, but in an orientation where the plumes spring away from the center swirl. I'm calling this first one Plume Curl Forward, and I'm calling it that because you begin by stitching a swirl, then stitch a series of plumes that curl around the swirl in a forward fashion. As you add each new plume, you taper the length of the plume as you work your way down the swirl. Now let's draw one out, and then we'll go and stitch some. I start by stitching a swirl, and then I backtrack on top of my already stitched line. Then I swing out a bit for my first plume. I advance a bit, then swing out and stitch a new curved hook or plume. And after sneaking down my already stitched line just a bit, I swing out and add another plume. Notice that I can add as many plumes as I wish to a given swirled plumette unit, but I aim for at least 3 plumes. Once I'm done, I can swing away and begin a brand new unit, again starting with a swirl. Now let's stitch this out. This is a small quilt, so I'm only using one clamp of my suspension system, and I'm doing this because it eliminates the quilt pulling against me as it would as it falls off the edge of my extension table. Anytime I can make the work of quilting easier, I take that option. I begin by stitching a swirl, and I'm doing this with a single line of stitching as opposed to 2 lines with a channel between them. After carefully backtracking down part of my swirl, I swing out and sew a hook that will be my first plume. I taper the base of the plume as I approach the base of the swirl, and then I join to the original thread line. I carefully backtrack a short distance again, then I swing out with a hook to create the second plume and taper its base again. I repeat this process, forming plumes by starting from the base or the tip of the hook as I add to my swirled plumette. Once I'm ready to begin a new swirled plumette, I backtrack partway up the last plume edge and then swing out to form a new swirl. I then build my next swirled plumette by adding a series of hooks just like before. You can see that we are borrowing from the bumpback feather method to create these units. As we work, we are creating small spaces between our swirled plumettes. Most of these spaces will remain blank, but if I've got an unusually large space, I will stitch a few pebbles to fill in that space and can easily emerge from the pebbles to begin a new swirl. Personally, I'm not a fan of pebbling as a background fill design, so I really aim to keep my groups of pebbles small. Notice that I can easily sneak out of a tight spot with careful backtracking, and once I emerge, I can begin a brand new swirled plumette. Pretty cool, isn't it? Now let's look at a variation of this design. This time, we're still creating the design with swirls and plumes that curl around the swirl, but can you see that these plumes curl away from the swirl instead of toward the swirl? It's aptly named Plume Curl Away. Other than plumes curling in opposite directions along the swirl, there's really no big difference between these two designs. Let's stitch this one out. We again begin by stitching a swirl, but after a short period of backtracking, I swing out to stitch my first plume. I spring from the swirl's base to stitch my second plume, and just like in the earlier design, I'm tapering the length of these plumes as I add them to my growing swirled plumette unit. Just like before, my goal is to have at least 3 plumes in any swirled plumette, and you'll determine how many you can add by what space is available to you. I can easily begin a new swirled plumette by swinging away from the current plumette to form a new swirl, and then I begin adding plumes just like we did before. Notice that I am taking a lot more liberties with this variation, and I really feel very free to extend the length of my plumes just to fill space. This is a great example of what I mean when I say that I'm taking more liberties. Notice how I'm stretching out certain plumes to completely fill a blank space instead of tapering them all as I did in the first design. And just like before, notice that I'm throwing in small clusters of pebbles every now and then. And there you have it, 2 swirled plumette motifs. Know that whenever you combine plumes and swirls, it will always go together perfectly. You have nothing to worry about, so go for it. In the meantime, so long and take care.